It's a pleasure to have with us this morning Diana Glyer, professor of English at Azusa Pacific University in Azusa, California. Dr. Glyer earned her Bachelor of Science in English and Fine Arts at Bowling Green State University, her MS in Education at Northern Illinois University, and her PhD in English at the University of Illinois in Chicago. She is an award-winning writer who has spent more than 40 years combing through archives and studying old manuscripts. She's a leading expert on C.S. Lewis and J.R.R. Tolkien, among other inklings. And her book, The Company They Keep, C.S. Lewis and J.R.R. Tolkien as Writers in Community, changed the way that we talk about these two influential Christian figures. Her more recent book, Bandersnatch, C.S. Lewis, J.R.R. Tolkien, and the Creative Collaboration of the Inklings, teaches us how to follow in their footsteps. Diana's scholarship, her teaching, and her work as an artist all circle back to one common theme: creativity thrives in community. And I just learned this morning, to my delight, that on August 3rd, that's less than a month, her newest book will be released, A Compass for Deep Heaven. This is a series of essays to help people navigate their way through C.S. Lewis's science fiction books, and it is available for pre-order on Amazon.com and probably at your favorite local bookstore as well. Dr. Glyer's work on Lewis suggests an unanticipated source for his lasting accomplishments. It is universally recognized that Lewis was highly talented. He studied in the best schools and excelled there, and that he came to deep and abiding faith in Jesus Christ. But there's another essential component, one that catalyzed all the others, and it was, quite simply, his gift for friendship. Lewis lived in a world that was no less prone to fracture and division than our current time. How did he learn to overcome the issues that divide and engage in daily patterns of successful collaboration while doing all that? Who are the important friends who helped to bring out the very best in him? And what might we learn from his example as we emerge from social distancing and engage with one another in a post-pandemic world? That's the topic for this morning: the future of friendship, relationships after the pandemic. Diana Glyer, welcome. Thank you for being with us this morning. It's great to have you with us.
Oh, thank you, Quinn. I've been so enjoying the summer speaker series, and it's an honor to be here today and to have a chance to talk about one of my favorite subjects, C.S. Lewis in community, highlighting, I think, for us, his gift for friendship, as you say. I've been inspired by C.S. Lewis, not only his books, which have meant so much to me over the years, but really looking at the pattern of his life. And one of the important things that we often overlook is that Lewis had a lifelong pattern of making friends, especially with people who held contrasting views and who had, I would say, profoundly different approaches to life and faith. These friendships had an influence on him, and I would say, I don't think it's too much to say that these friendships had a profound influence on the fact that his books continue to have such an impact on the world. So let me start here as we talk about this idea of Lewis in community. I want to start with kind of an experiment. Would you take a minute just right now? And would you imagine not Lewis and the Inklings, but let's start a little further back. Let's start with Michelangelo, the great painter. Can you picture him at work, painting the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel? Imagine it just for a moment, as completely and as vividly as you can. That tiny chapel, the stained glass windows, the elaborate scaffolding, the smoke rising from the candles that light his way. Maybe paint and brushes and supplies scattered about him. Michelangelo painting the Sistine Chapel. Can you picture it? Now I want you to focus for just a moment on a completely different setting. Let's move away from Vatican City in 1508 and imagine instead, just for a moment, a big factory in New Jersey in the late 1800s. I'd like for you, just for a moment, to try to picture Thomas Edison. He's standing at a long laboratory table. working on experiment after experiment, trying to engineer a light bulb. He's working with scattered bits of wire and globes of glass. Remember how he persisted in experiment after experiment, hundreds of them. How hard he worked to try to figure it out and make that incandescent light bulb shine. Can you see it? Just one more, if you would. We tried to picture an artist at work. We tried to picture an inventor. Now I want you to think about an author. For a moment, let's take J.R.R. Tolkien, working away in Oxford. Tolkien has a busy household. He has 4 young children. So late at night, after he tells the children their bedtime stories and they fall asleep, after the house is quiet, Tolkien retreats to his desk. Now, he is a messy writer. His workplace is piled high with books and papers, and he works late into the night. He draws maps, he sketches, and he paints. He adds new vocabulary words to his invented languages. And he writes the epic story of Frodo and Sam and the adventures of Middle-earth. Well, thanks for taking an experiment with me and thinking about Michelangelo and Thomas Edison and J.R.R. Tolkien. Now, here's what is striking to me about those images that we conjured up together. I find that most people, when they picture each of these individuals, they picture them very much working alone to paint, to invent, working alone to write and to create. That idea, that concept that these men worked alone, that's what we call the myth of the solitary genius. The myth of the solitary genius. I think we all tend to think about creative breakthroughs as if they were individual accomplishments. You know, a sudden bolt of inspiration comes. We focus on the individual, and no matter the setting or time period, we almost always picture them all by themselves. Well, let me be clear. All 3 of these men are geniuses. And I'm not trying to say anything to take away from that. They are people with enormous talent. And not only that, they're people with the drive and the character that allowed them to hone their skills and use their talents powerfully. There is no doubt about it. But the idea that genius or talent resides in certain individuals and is expressed in genius breakthroughs made by those individuals is a really problematic idea. What do I mean by that? Let's go back to our opening image. Michelangelo was a genius, but whether he was working to paint the Sistine Chapel or carve a block of marble, in these accomplishments, he worked as the member of a very large circle or school of fellow artists. First as a student and then as a teacher. The team worked together on the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel. The team of artists, they mixed the colors, they applied the layers of plaster, they ran up and down that scaffolding with supplies. But did you know that they also sketched and actually painted aspects of those images that we attribute to Michelangelo alone? In other words, if we want to understand Michelangelo and what really led to the kind of things that he accomplished, we need to picture him as a master collaborator. All of his life, he produced wonderful work as one member of a team that brought out the best in him and made it possible for him to do what he did. Friends, assistants, co-workers, patrons, and teachers. You know, even his famous rivalries helped to motivate him and challenge him to get better and to do more. He was not alone, and he was not working a lonely, isolated existence. He created masterpieces, always surrounded by good friends. Well, what about Thomas Edison? Edison was a genius instigator, But that laboratory that he worked in, at any given time, he was surrounded by 50 or 60 coworkers in that lab. In fact, some of you may know that Edison did very little hands-on lab work himself. He prompted and initiated and directed the work of others in a noisy, busy, productive setting. Now we can read that Thomas Edison is given the credit for more than 1,000 inventions, including the phonograph and the first practical incandescent light bulb. But here's the thing. How did these inventions emerge? Edison created a research and development facility in Menlo Park, New Jersey, that he called the Invention Factory. Listen, many people consider the facility itself to be a more important invention than any of his other breakthroughs. Why? Because the Invention Factory provides a highly effective blueprint still used today for the way that innovation thrives in community. Like Michelangelo, Edison was surrounded by others. His inventions, every one of them, had the benefit of a wide variety of talent, insight, varied personalities, and perspectives. As I researched his creative process, I found it especially interesting that even though he hired quite a number of trained experts, most of his co-workers in the Invention Factory, they were just ambitious young creatives eager to learn and excited to make a difference. Think about all the benefits of a highly energized and interactive environment, all that creative energy gathered together in that room day after day. It is that interaction that led to so much success and so many breakthroughs and so many innovations. And we are still reaping the benefits today. So what's the big idea here? I think it's about shifting our mindset, changing the picture, shaking off some of our entrenched ways of thinking. Here's the thing, the myth of the solitary genius makes for great movies and terrific novels, but honestly, it is not the normal way that creativity, innovation, breakthrough, and change take place. And even more, as we think about our own lives, the myth of the solitary genius, it's not an ideal way for us to be happy and productive, for us to create a life where we thrive. We may not be painting or inventing, but as the people of God, we are very concerned about demonstrating the kingdom of God. And in so many ways, for so many reasons, we do better when we do what we do in the context of important friendships. In my research, the more I have looked at high achievers in practically every field you can think of, I've noticed a tendency to focus on individuals. But what I'd encourage you to do is every time you hear about the accomplishments of a high achiever, I want you to think about a film technique, where you have the close-up, but then the camera draws back and you get the larger context. Because that individual so often is simply one member of a phenomenal team. Let me say it this way. True genius does not reside like a jewel in the soul, a kind of a unique superpower to be exercised by individuals at will. I think for all of us, I mean it, for every one of us, our talents and our gifts thrive in what's called the transactional space between a gifted individual and a rich environment of friendship. We all need people who bring out our best, who call forth what is in us, who bless what is good in us and true and beautiful. So when I talk about collaboration, what I'm really talking about is the way that we can learn to bring out the best in each other, as well as the way that more globally we can shift our fundamental mindset from a highly individualistic view to a highly interactive one. Again, Michelangelo, Edison, Tolkien, they were incredibly smart and talented and motivated. But their gifts, like our gifts, are catalyzed by the decisions we make to deliberately and persistently make connections with others, to surround ourselves with friends who encourage us, challenge us, and work together with us through good times and through hard times, who offer support and also practical help. So let's take a deeper look at C.S. Lewis as an example. When C.S. Lewis started teaching at Oxford, he met Tolkien there. Tolkien was a fellow teacher and they met at a faculty meeting. But you may have heard that that first meeting, it was not very promising. From the start, Lewis and Tolkien did not like each other. A number of reasons for that, but I think one of the big ones is that they're so different. So when you picture Lewis, understand he was outspoken, energetic, and opinionated. He was also an atheist at this point in his life, early in his career as he started teaching at Oxford. And Lewis's academic interests, those things that defined his mindset and his interests, Lewis was primarily interested in literature and philosophy. Tolkien, on the other hand, a very different personality. He was quite introverted and actually he was quite shy. At the time that they met, Tolkien was a devout Catholic and in fact had been faithful all his life. Tolkien's academic love was not literature, it was linguistics. Above all else, Tolkien loved languages. So these two men were so different, and it's no wonder that they immediately disagreed. Lewis wrote about meeting Tolkien in his diary that night, and he describes Tolkien as a smooth, pale, fluent little chap. And then Lewis added, "There's no harm in him. He only needs a smack or so." This was not a great beginning. But these two very different men became very good friends over time. And one of the things that's interesting to me is that it was Tolkien, the shy and quiet and contemplative one, it was Tolkien who initiated their friendship. He did it by starting a small book club, gathering some men together to discuss old Icelandic sagas. And Lewis was delighted to join them because these are books he had loved all his life. The two men, so different from one another, they became friends as they discussed the books that they loved. And when that book club ended, Tolkien and Lewis decided to commit to meeting together once a week. So they met together every Monday for lunch and conversation. And Lewis, again writing in his diary, called those Monday meetings the most pleasant spot in his week. Then, here's what happens next. One afternoon in December of 1929, Tolkien again took the initiative. Now, he'd been working on a long narrative poem called The Lay of Lathian. And Tolkien did a crazy thing. He gave the rough draft of that poem to C.S. Lewis, and he asked Lewis to read it and give him feedback. Well, Lewis took the manuscript and he did read it. And that very night, he wrote a half-page letter of praise for that poem. And then 3 weeks later, he wrote a 14-page critique of Tolkien's poem, full of specific suggestions for improvement. Now, here's what's really interesting to me. Tolkien loved the second letter, the critique, far more than he liked the first. Why is that? In C.S. Lewis, Tolkien had found a friend who took his work seriously enough to lavish time and attention on every detail. Someone who had a different point of view, but because he had a different point of view, he noticed things that he hadn't. Tolkien had found someone who believed in the project enough to invest in it and want to make it better. So This simple lunch, this once a week meeting went so much deeper as Lewis and Tolkien began to share their work with one another. Other friends were invited to join them, and this simple Monday lunch slowly grew into the heroic group of writers we know as the Inklings. Over the years, there were 19 men who became members of the group, who gathered once or twice each week and shared the things that they were working on, shared the rough drafts right in the mess of it with one another, and supported one another through conversation, questions, suggestions, and criticism. And the group thrived for almost 2 decades. Lewis's books and Tolkien's books, the best way to think about them, I think, is that they were forged in the context of friendship. Those books, they were the fruit or the outworking of the conversations that happened around the table within this group. No, they weren't lonely and isolated geniuses. Lewis and Tolkien created intentional time to meet and then committed themselves to support one another. How important was that friendship? Well, Tolkien says repeatedly in his letters that if it hadn't been for C.S. Lewis, he never would have brought The Lord of the Rings to a conclusion. Now, I'm fascinated with the way that this group of men interacted week by week. I've been studying it for years. I want to know everything I can about what they said to each other and what difference it made to the books that they were writing. And generally, when we think of a writing group, we think about it as being a critique session. But I think there are a lot of other aspects of their interaction that are instructive to us. Well, for one thing, Tolkien was a perfectionist and a procrastinator. And part of the reason that Tolkien finished Lord of the Rings at all was because Lewis and the Inklings provided accountability. Accountability, or maybe a better word is expectation, right? So just having a regular Thursday meeting week after week after week, that would be motivation to keep moving forward on the project, right? They met once a week, and Lewis had sort of an opening for the meetings of the Inklings. He would light his pipe and he would say, well, has nobody got anything to read us? That powerful question kept Tolkien working on his story. It kept him focused. I love the idea of expectation as an important aspect of friendship. Expecting the best from one another. So accountability was important, praise was important, encouragement is important, but I think we need challenge as much as we need positivity in order to grow. In our friendships, there has to be room for correction. But even there, I think we can shift our understanding a little bit, because I think that correction needs to be more than just naming the problem. I think it means offering suggestions, practical help about how to make things right. When I think about critique, I think about it more in terms of coming alongside and helping one another to open up new possibilities. I think in friendship, there's also a great need for mentoring. That is, sharing the things that we have tried, lavishing our expertise on one another, and saying in essence, hey, you know what, here's what worked for me. Maybe you could try it. Maybe it would work for you too. So I'd encourage you to think about all these different ways of interacting and how much the members of the group, the Inklings, benefited from them. Accountability, correction, expectation, praise, encouragement, and mentoring. I'd like to mention one more. It's a word that's come to mean so much to me. In fact, it's the idea that probably means the very most to me when I think about collaboration. And that's the idea of what it means to be a resonator. A resonator. A resonator is someone who's just there, right? Who just shows up the way that we are present to one another. So often I think in friendship, we don't need to do anything. We just need to be there. A resonator shows up, listens, cares, and offers ongoing support. I think often about whether we would even know the names C.S. Lewis and J.R.R. Tolkien if these two very different individuals had not overcome their resistance to one another and found ways to bridge the gap of their deep differences and learn to work together. And then as their friendship flourished, making a commitment to spend time with each other regularly, our abilities like theirs are catalyzed when we make a commitment to connect. One of the most important results that these important friendships had for C.S. Lewis, his salvation. Tolkien prayed daily for his friend Lewis, and God used conversations with Tolkien, along with Tolkien's insights and the fruit of his prayers as the key elements that brought C.S. Lewis, the atheist, to faith in Christ. So my focus in this talk has been on making connections, seeking deeper friendships, and finding ways to love and serve one another. I think, frankly, this can be hard. And it's hard for a number of reasons. For one thing, I really do believe that all of us have been steeped in this kind of mindset of individuality. The myth of the solitary genius has done terrible damage. It's our automatic way of thinking, and it makes it harder for us to shift to an interactive, or what we call a transactional view, one that says that the whole is greater than the sum of its parts, one that spurs us to offer each other the gifts of encouragement and challenge. It makes it harder to remember how much each one of us needs resonators, people who aren't content to be superficial, who walk with us side by side. I do think our technology is helping us develop better models of collaboration. I think there are changes, and I see in my students a greater freedom to work together and to invest in each other than I have in years past. Things do seem to be changing, and I think there's reason to be encouraged. But these days, in addition to our assumptions about individuality and our busyness, I think there are other obstacles to overcome as well. How often have we heard it? We live in unprecedented times. We are all healing from the trauma caused by this pandemic. In California, the shelter-in-place restrictions have been fierce. It's been so difficult and so damaging. For me, I think it's the constant stream of the news stories, warning of danger in the air we breathe, talking daily of statistics and death tolls. I feel like we've been bombarded with messages that have led to even deeper patterns of isolation and loneliness and fear. And that's not all. To call this a contentious season is an understatement. Our communities, even our churches, have been splintering because of hotly contested issues. I loved the talk a few weeks ago by Dr. Erica Salkin. She talked about civil discourse and free expression, and I learned a lot from the smart way she put the question of free speech into larger contexts. She emphasized this, quote, "We need to hear from voices that have historically and currently been silenced." And I think she's right. That idea to hear voices that are coming from different perspectives, not only in the media, but around our dining room tables, is one key to moving forward. To underscore that a little bit, I've spoken elsewhere about the idea of intellectual hospitality. Intellectual hospitality is rooted in the ancient Greek concept of xenia, which spells out very specific guidelines that govern how a guest is expected to behave in someone's home, and the equally specific guidelines that spell out how a host can welcome the strangers. You see examples of Sania all over ancient literature. It's especially clear in Homer's Odyssey. For us, as we're emerging into a new season, I think we can bring the concept of intellectual hospitality up to date by cultivating a willingness to read news from a variety of points of view, by making sure that our social media streams represent a variety of people, not only from different backgrounds, but different ages and different convictions. And by being less terrified, but instead learning to listen and then to ask great questions as we encounter people who hold convictions that are different from our own. I just used the word terrified. Is terrified too strong a word to describe the kind of effect that all this unrest has had? I don't know. I don't think so. I so appreciated the insights offered by Mark Laberton a few weeks ago. It was a great talk. And there's a point that he made right at the beginning of his talk. Here's what he said. He said, one of the things that distinguishes this moment is that not only are we living in a time of crises, but many of the crises are being received as though they are truly life-threatening. It's like life is considered to be on the line, as opposed to just having armchair differences, even passionate differences. Therefore, it makes people desperate, even more fearful, even more just stressed about whatever they consider to be right and wrong steps, because it feels like there really is something of the first order that's at stake. He continues, that's true, obviously, in relationship to the pandemic, but it's also true in relationship to issues of race or gender or economic inequality or many other things that are just this sense that something primary is really on the line. And then he says, people are desperate to fight more easily and deeply and protractedly than might otherwise have been true. It's the end of that quote. He uses the word desperate, terrified, stressed, fearful. Dr. Laberton suggests that one step that we can take is to shift away from being centered on our sociology and instead becoming more profoundly centered on the meaning of our faith and its integration into everything that we are facing. So in the two talks from this year's summer series, in his talk and in my talk, you have two invitations to make fundamental shifts. Dr. Laberton suggests that we shift our attention from sociological perspectives and recenter our attention on theological perspectives, focusing afresh on the meaning of our faith. And in today's talk, I've been suggesting that we shift our point of view, our imagination, if you will, from a highly individualistic way of thinking to one that is oriented toward building and sustaining relationships. How do we move forward? It's a very big question for an early Sunday morning. And I'm not a theologian or a political analyst. I'm an English teacher. And I've been studying the Inklings for more than 40 years. But knowing what I know about that famous group of Christian writers, I have just a few thoughts about what we can learn from their example. Before I detail those, though, could I just make one observation? While it's totally fair to call recent events unprecedented times, perhaps there is also a way that we have gone too far in emphasizing the uniqueness of this season. I think about C.S. Lewis and the Inklings working away in England in the 1930s and the 1940s. During World War II, the idea of curfews and shelter in place, this was very familiar to them. daily news with statistics of death tolls, constant warnings about imminent danger. They understood it better than we do. I mean, C.S. Lewis had a bomb shelter built in his backyard. If you go visit his home in Oxford today, you can still see it. A bomb shelter dug into the hillside not far from his front door. And back then, there was also a lot of difference of perspective and a lot of suspicion, especially suspicion of those who were perceived to be different. There were internment camps and interrogations, and all of it felt like a matter of life and death, just to be sure which side someone was on. And not only that, there were shortages too. I don't know what kind of shortages you faced on the East Coast during the early days of the pandemic. We had problems with groceries and getting gas for our cars, but back then, during Lewis's time, during wartime, the Inklings faced rationing on all of their staples: sugar, butter, meat, and tea. Let me tell you one small detail about the Inklings. I've mentioned encouragement and advice and the important role of resonators. There's one other way that the Inklings expressed their friendship for one another, and that was offering practical help in light of these shortages. Practical help. Two quick examples. Some American friends had learned that Lewis was having difficulty getting groceries, and so they would offer supplies. They would put together care packages and send them to Lewis. And Lewis would open these care packages while the Inklings were gathered. And as he opened those boxes full of unobtainable treasures, he would distribute the contents, sharing all of it. Now, I was curious to learn the one thing the Inklings loved best that was in these care packages. And it turns out it was when someone from the States would send them a canned ham. Now, these occasional hams led to what became famous for the Inklings ham suppers. It became an Inklings tradition. There's one other shortage I want to mention, because when I think about the Inklings, it touches me so deeply. During the wartime, as the Inklings were meeting, they were facing severe shortages of paper. Now, for a writer in the days before computers, not having enough paper, it means you can't write. So it became a habit of the members of the Inklings throughout their week to start collecting up scraps of paper, envelopes, paper bags, old student exams, and bring them to Inklings meetings. In studying manuscripts of the poems and the stories that the Inklings wrote, one of the things that's astonishing is to see how often these are written on little scraps of paper that were gathered by the friends. Those who needed paper would come to meetings and they would take what they needed. It reminds me of 2 Corinthians chapter 8, right? Where the Apostle Paul commends the Macedonian church for their generosity, quoting, "And the terrible ordeal they suffered, their abundant joy and deep poverty overflowed into rich generosity. For I testify," says Paul, "that they gave according to their ability. And not only did they do as we expected, but they gave themselves first to the Lord and then to us, because that was the will of God." And in that chapter 8 of 2 Corinthians, it ends with this glorious declaration, "And my God will supply all your needs according to his glorious riches in Christ Jesus. To our God and Father be glory forever and ever." Practical help. It comes from knowing one another well enough to know what we need. It also comes from trusting one another deeply enough to be able to admit that we have needs, and learning to be bold enough to say so. In 40 years of studying the Inklings, I'm constantly challenged not only by their books, but by their example. Maybe like me, you're feeling a little shell-shocked after the kind of year we've had. For me, it feels like I'm slowly waking up from some kind of daze and trying to make sense of what we've been through. I'm still trying to figure out what it will take to move forward, but in light of these issues, let me make 3 very modest suggestions. Number 1, I think that we should start small. When we think of the Inklings, if we've heard about their gatherings, if we know something about their meetings, we think about the 19 men who wrote more than 100 books and whose work continues to dominate bestseller lists and influence generations of readers and moviegoers. But all of that started in the smallest and simplest way that you can imagine. C.S. Lewis and J.R.R. Tolkien became friends through a little book club. And when the book club ended, they decided they enjoyed one another's company, so they made the decision to get together once a week for lunch. That's it. A little book club, time for lunch. Start small. Their small meetings energized the week and catalyzed their creativity. And it grew slowly and organically. It grew into something big and lasting. So number 1, I'd suggest that we just start small. And number 2, deliberately embrace difference. Lewis and Tolkien were very different in lots of ways, different in personality and training and convictions, and very different in faith. It's so interesting to me that later in life, they said it was their differences that laid the foundation for the profound influence they were able to have on one another. Isn't that interesting? They didn't become an effective team in spite of their differences. Listen, they became lifelong friends and collaborators because of those differences. Number 3, it encourages to cultivate curiosity. A lot of times when we encounter different points of view, our first impulse is to critique and correct. And there is an appropriate, meaningful time for that. I am constantly challenged by the words of the prayer attributed to Saint Francis. A prayer that encourages us to seek first to understand. When I teach classes in the Honors College at APU, I often write that phrase up on the board. Seek first to understand. I want my students to cultivate curiosity. I want them to slow down a little bit. I want them to read great books and seek first to understand what the author is saying. I want them to stop reading books in order to cherry pick their favorite quotes or in order to marshal a list of contradictions to argue with the stuff they don't like. I also want my students to engage with one another honestly, patiently, exercising intellectual hospitality, seeking first to understand a different point of view, and then spending time listening and clarifying that they've understood correctly. I want my students to learn to ask great questions, like, what facts are you basing that on? Or why are you drawn to that conclusion? Or what is appealing to you about that course of action? If we're really going to heal from the issues that divide us, we need more patience. We need more mutual respect. And we need to learn to ask better questions. So that's 3 practical ideas. Start small, embrace difference, and cultivate curiosity. And that's a little bit about C.S. Lewis and the Inklings and the topic of friendship. Thanks for letting me share that. And I'd love to hear any questions that you have.
Thank you so much, Diana. So much rich food for thought, and not just thinking, but acting. So there is now an opportunity to ask a few questions. But before we get to those, it struck me as you spoke, what a compelling and a desirable situation you portrayed. And I found myself longing for that, but not knowing quite how to get it. And then it dawned on me that we all kind of have a responsibility to be that for other people. And as we are that, and if we see that as part of our Christian vocation, then it will happen. And we do small groups. It sounds to me like this was a form of a Christian small group that went together. Although not to begin with, because Lewis wasn't a Christian when they started. So yeah, they're just really, really helpful things. So Kathy Arvison asks or comments, your depiction of the Inklings was very compelling. However, this was a single sex group. Maybe Dorothy Sayers attended from time to time, but to what extent she was fully accepted, you will have a perspective on, but it sounds like she might not have been. What observations about the different dynamics of women's groups, men's groups, and mixed groups for all of this do you have?
Yeah, oh, that's a great question. So Dorothy Sayers was a great friend of a number of the Inklings. She was especially good friends with Charles Williams, one of the lesser known and perhaps more odd members of the group, odd in a number of ways. So no, women never attended the Thursday night writing group. And that's not a reflection of sexist perspectives. The Inklings had actually 2 meetings a week. They had the closed meetings that would have been in Lewis's private rooms at the college on Thursday nights. And those meetings were modeled after what are called essay clubs. They're still common at Oxford, and they are still almost exclusively single gendered. So there are women's essay clubs and there are men's essay clubs. And when you are reading in the vulnerability of reading a rough draft of something where the ink is hardly dry, right? Our research shows that the ways that men critique one another and the ways that women go about it, one isn't better than the other. Actually, one isn't more brutal than the other. They're just rather different. And so it is the habit in Oxford for essay clubs to be single gendered. However, the Inklings met twice a week. They met Tuesdays at the Eagle and Child pub. Some of you know that. And if you've been to Oxford, it says on the wall of that pub that they read their manuscripts there. They did not. Those were open meetings. Students were involved, visitors came all the time, and many women were part of that circle. So the Inklings had more than one mode, right? Sometimes it's better to meet with a smaller group, sometimes with a larger group, sometimes with a more focused purpose, sometimes with an open arm. And so I think this variety of kinds of gatherings is a really important aspect. The idea that Lewis was somehow misogynistic or close to him, and that's been examined in lots of papers and books and dismissed. It simply isn't true. Lewis's generosity, especially toward his female students, extended as far as paying for their tuition anonymously behind the scenes because he believed so much in the importance of women's education.
Thank you. John Gregg makes this observation first. So much of this is relevant to remote work. Mm-hmm. This past year, many have come to see themselves as silos of productivity that can exist alone. What are the long-term impacts of that mentality?
Wow. Here's what I'm hoping from the experience that we've all had with more Zoom meetings and remote learning experiences than most of us signed up for. So I taught entirely online for this past academic year, and it is not easy. It is exhausting. But as we emerge, as at APU, we're going to be meeting live and in person in classrooms around a table. I'm so excited. But I still have now in my back pocket possibilities for virtual meetings that I can add into the possibility of in-person meetings. I think in-person meetings are important because we are incarnate individuals. We're embodied and enfleshed. And I think that there is something very important that happens as we connect face to face. But I'm also fortunate, I think, to be able to think about, well, I can't meet with that person because they're far away or the times won't work. And so I have the option to at least connect and converse and to add these things in. I think we're going to have to shift, though, and figure out how we can spend time in real time with others. I think it's important for our mental health and the health of our souls to not forsake the gathering together. I think it's important. I think it matters.
Thanks. Eleanor Higginbotham, who is also a professor of poetry and English, thank you for your beautiful presentation and for tapping into past parallel presentations. Mark and Erica Salkin were inklings for you in preparing. Yes. Do you have a group like this at the university or in your personal life? And is there that? So that's one question. And the second one, and I'm also curious about this. Does anybody challenge you in the way, to do the kinds of things, that would terrify you or make you uncomfortable, and how do you respond?
Well, there's a lot there. First of all, thank you for noting the interaction, right? The pleasure that I had listening to your speaker series and being able to sort of bounce off some of those ideas. What I said in my talk would not have looked like it looked if I had not listened in to those other wise teachers. And so trying, obviously not very sneaky about it, but trying, right, to model a little bit of what I'm talking about, which is the way that as we interact, we sharpen our thinking and we enrich the conversation. So thank you for calling me out on that. But truly, I think what you've done with your summer speaker series has been extraordinary. And I hope that people will take the time to go back through and really listen. The wonder of being able to do this by YouTube is that we can slow it down and we can rehear and re-listen and we can study and we can take notes more quickly, more completely than we can as this goes zipping by in real time. The question of, do I have a group? Yes, I do. And one of the things that people like, I want to be an inkling. I want to start an inklings group. And I'm like, that's great. Well, the first thing you need to decide is what kind of group do you need? And I think there are lots of different kinds of groups. They had a writer's critique group. That was sort of the center of gravity. But then they had these other meetings, like meeting at the pub for lunch or meeting in groups of 2 or 3 for special topics that they were wrestling with, short-term kinds of meetings. And so the question is, what kind of group do you need? Do you need a critique group? Do you need just a companionship group? Do you need a mentoring group where more experienced individuals get together with younger individuals and help in terms of mentoring along? Do you need a topic group where you pick a topic for a season and meet simply to discuss and to bring ideas and talk about them? So I think that you need to figure out what kind of group you need. What kind of group I need, the kind of group that I have really immersed myself in, is a group that's been meeting now for, 23 years, 24 years, and it's a prayer group. So I founded and I pastor the Creative Artists Prayer Fellowship here. And while in some ways it's modeled on the Inklings, what's different about it is that we find that what we need more than anything else is to meet regularly to pray for one another. So when I get an invitation to give a talk like this, I bring it to my prayer group and I say, what do you hear the Lord saying? Will you partner with me in going through this process of preparing for this? And in fact, one of the members of my prayer group heard an early draft of the talk and challenged me and sharpened the talk. So I almost always bounce a talk or draft a talk off of a different group of people just to get feedback. And the question of, do I have people who challenge me? Have you guys met 18-year-olds, 19-year-olds, 20-year-olds? I teach college and I teach in the honors college with some of the brightest and the best. And so, oh my goodness, challenge is kind of the name of the game every time I step into a classroom.
Thanks. Lorene Glazer asks, you mentioned Greek rules for hosts and guests. Can you share some of those relevant rules with us?
That's a long topic, right? So I gave a talk at the C.S. Lewis Foundation event in Oxford several years ago, and that talk, C.S. Lewis at Table with Zeus and Dante is the name of it. It's on YouTube and you can listen to the whole talk. C.S. Lewis at Table with Zeus and Dante. And in that, I tried to lay out a lot of the rules of Xenia and kind of the guidelines of intellectual hospitality. But I think what's important to emphasize here in just the couple minutes that we have is that when we encounter difficult conversations, both parties have to agree to ground rules. And I think that that's one of the keys with Xenia. People say, well, I want to have intellectual hospitality, but this person is toxic to me, or this person's view, they're offensive to me, or I can't talk to that person without a fight breaking out. And I say, great, they're not entering into an intellectually hospitable environment where it's possible to have these kinds of conversations. And so both parties have to agree that we're not going to attack individuals. We're not going to be dismissive of one another. We're going to commit to listening and asking questions. And I think that one of the aspects of that is when we engage on really tough topics, what we want to do so often is change people's minds. And what intellectual hospitality encourages us to do is to change our understanding. So to me, the outcome of a good encounter is not, you've changed my mind, or I totally agree with you now, but I still disagree. However, I understand more than I ever have before what it is you believe and why you believe that. And I think that that is a spectacular outcome or goal. And that's the goal of intellectual hospitality.
Thank you. And on that note, I'll just mention that our congregation has been invited to read John Perkins' One Blood. It's a helpful book on the very real topic of race and racial relations and the issues that surround that. And then in the fall, the possibility of being in small discussion groups. And so what a great guideline that we're there to listen to each other and to improve our understanding, not to convince, even though I know that my perspective is the right one, right? There are a couple of questions that are left over, and I am now sharing your website in the chat where you blog on things. And so I'm going to send these questions to you so that you can think about them and perhaps blog on them. But for now, I want to thank you, Diana, for being with us, and also thank all of those who have joined us online, and invite you to pray with me as we close. Gracious God, we are grateful for the faithfulness of J.R.R. Tolkien in pursuing a friendship with so many people, but particularly C.S. Lewis. And just the great contribution and improvement of the kingdom on earth that you blessed and made fruitful through that. Lord, we are not either of those, but we are who you have called us to be. And so we pray that you would inspire in us a desire to seek these kinds of collaborative and hospitable relationships with others, And may that begin with us. So may we know the joy of being hospitable and collaborative friends in our lives. Guide us in that direction, we ask in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen.
Again, Diana, thank you for being with us, and thanks to all. And we'll say goodbye for now.
Thank you so much.